So this second lesson on Parsha Shoftim is found in Deuteronomy 17, chapter 17, verses 14 through 18. And if you remember from the first lesson, we're looking at this from the perspective of consciousness and higher consciousness of ourselves, right? So if you read the Torah portion, on its surface, it's really just talking about when you come into the land. You've been wandering around now in the wilderness, and now you're going to go into the land. Set up these particular uh, rules and regulations. The Sanhedrin was set up from the first verse where it says established judges that were actually like sort of the Supreme Court in the land when the Hebrews occupied the land. And but there was 70 of them. So imagine 70 Supreme Court justices. But as we talked about this, we took on the Kabbalistic understanding that the trees are green, the forest is green because of the individual trees being green, meaning that the consciousness of the people in any given community or society, the level of consciousness or the type of consciousness of the people sort of dictates what its governing forces will be. So a loving and kind, compassionate and holy group of people will elect governors who are kind and righteous and seek peace and are beneficent towards its people. So rather than just looking at this and saying, judging sort of our own government and other governments, we're not looking at it like that. It has that angle to it, and you're welcome to do it outside of this. But in this context, we're looking at it as we are the Sanhedrin. We are the judges of our lives, of our consciousness. And now in today's particular portion of the Parsha, we're looking at the king. So I want to really put our attention on the 7 double letters a little bit for a moment and just give a brief explanation before I read from the Torah itself. So as we know, if we've taken the Sefer Yetzirah class, or even if you've just been in these Zooms for a while, most of the Abalafian tradition of Kabbalistic meditation comes from the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation. And in the Book of Formation, the letters are described rather than in a typical sort of linear way, which is Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, like that. It's described as mothers, the 3 mothers, the fathers, the double letters, and then the elemental letters, right? And all of those have a place in the energy of creation. So these sound vibrations and these names and combinations of letters and names make sound vibrations that affect creation and formation in all these different ways. And whether they're Sanskrit sounds or Hebrew sounds or whatever other sounds, the sounds are the sounds. So Aleph has a sound ah, it might have another sound in the Sanskrit language. It doesn't have another sound, it might have another name in the Sanskrit language. Who's doing about ah, all of these ahs have a particular vibrational energy. So for a moment, when we talk about the double letters, we can think about ourselves as we often do, as the Mishkan or temple. And deep within us is the Holy of Holies, that pure, unified field consciousness. It's undifferentiated. It's not It's not dualistic, it's one. Like in the Shema, it describes Yichad. Yud-He Vav-He is Yichad, the Lord is Yichad. So this is what the Kabbalists call Ein Sof, without end, that absolute, right? The double letters are the letters of the energy of the inner court, our own inner court in the Mishkan, this temple, right? And our inner court is basically where our emotions and thoughts and on a physiological level, our nervous system resides. So these double letters, those energies, have relations to different parts of the nervous system, parts of the brain. And so the double letters are Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Kaf, Pei, Resh, and Tav. And the letter Tav is the last one, and the letter Tav is sort of like the king of the inner court. So we have this experience of these different letters and peace and war and life and death and all of the experiences, the emotions and the thoughts, and where even our world of action emanates from this inner world of emotions and thoughts and so on and so forth, right? And as we become masters of the energies of these letters, ultimately, we become the governor of those letters. So in Shoftim, Moses is describing what the order and the way in which that would show up if, in fact, it was connected. So remember last week we talked about the two witnesses, and we related it to the Sanskrit term Yogastha Guru Kamani, which simply means established in unity, established in the Holy of Holies, perform action. When those things are connected, then the action shows up in a certain way. And that's the way it's being described here by Moses in this portion in Devarim. So the Tet, in particular, in this inner court, Amitav, excuse me, in this inner court, is the governor or the victory of the understanding of the duality of the double letter. So now I'm going to read this, what we're up to in Devarim, and we're going to talk a little bit further about it. When you come to the land that God your Lord is giving you, so that you have occupied it and settled it, you will eventually say, we would like to appoint a king, just like the other nations around us. So then you should appoint the king whom God your Lord will choose. You must appoint a king from among your brethren, not a stranger, foreigner, who is not one of your brethren. The king must not accumulate many horses, so as not to bring the people back to Egypt to get more horses. God has told you that you must never again return on that path. He also must not have many wives, so that they make his heart go astray. He shall likewise not accumulate much silver and gold. When the king is established on his royal throne, he must write a copy of this Torah, edited by the priests. The scroll must be always with him, and he shall read from it all the days of his life. He will then learn to be in awe of God his Lord, and carefully keep every word of this Torah and these rules. He will then not begin to feel superior to his brethren, and he will not stray from the mandate to the right or to the left. He and his descendants will then have a long reign in the midst of Israel. Okay, so the very first thing we notice is there's a big shift here right from the get-go. So in the beginning of this Torah portion, God through Moses says, do this, do that. established these judges, which became the Sanhedrin, right? Now he's saying, you know what? Because the Philistines have a king and these other nations around you have a king, you're going to want a king. So the rabbis, most of them, there's always a million different opinions, but the feeling is this is a concession, right? In other words, he's not saying you must have a king. He's saying you're going to want a king because the other nations have a king, and human nature will have it that you're like, oh, those guys have a king. I want to have a king too. So we get a king, right? So what he does is establish sort of the guidelines for having a king. And in so doing, those guidelines become guidelines for us in terms of how higher consciousness within us appears. And that we become the master of our own domain, so to speak, right? And one of the very first things is don't establish a king that's a stranger to you, right? So if we think about that on a personal level, inwardly, in this inner court, it really is we don't want to establish an idol from the outside, right? From out of the Holy of Holies, anything you establish, and this comes on the heels, if you remember from last lesson, where there's prohibition discussed about even setting up a stone memorial or a tree next to a place of worship. So what we talked about is this thing, what's the big deal about an idol? It keeps coming up over and over again in the Torah. In almost every portion, there's something about an idol. It's because that's what holds us back from experiencing the non-dual, unified nature of the essence of God within us and within everything. The unified field of pure consciousness. When we make a stranger a king within us. And how does that show up? It can show up in a million different ways. A hero, someone even in a spiritual realm that their word is your word now, and that becomes your king. It can be drugs, it can be alcohol, it can be a million different things that cause your inner spirit to be ruled by something that is strange to your nature. So the lesson here is what is revealed to you from the Holy of Holies is you. It's not a stranger. All of the brethren within you, you and all of your buddies, that is revealed to you from the unified field of pure consciousness comes from within. Even a Hebrew letter that enables you to experience these higher realms. Ultimately, as you meditate, the letter itself, you'll realize, is coming from within you. Maybe when you're a novice in the practice, you're always initiating a letter. But after you sit for a long time in practice, the letters come. The combination of the letters come. It's revealed from inside, right? So we don't establish a stranger as our king. That's the first point. The king, however, must not accumulate many horses so as not to bring the people back to Egypt to get more horses. God has told you that you must never again return on that path. I don't think God has a problem with horses, right? So what the message here is that Egypt, it's talking about returning to Egypt, right? Egypt in Hebrew is Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim actually means the narrow way. Okay, so the message here is we, the king, but we're talking about ourselves. We don't want to return. So when we look at the Sefer Yetzirah, it talks about 32 enlightenments, 32 magical paths available to us in a lifetime that we can experience these higher states of consciousness. But we don't ever want to take steps back. We're always taking steps forward. So Mitzrayim being the narrow way, the confined way, narrow ways of thinking, right? Don't be tempted to return to that as you grow in higher consciousness. And that's really the message there. Because Egypt at the time, maybe even today, I don't know, was a land of many horses. So the thinking was, if your king has a bunch of horses, he's going to start trading them with Egypt. And before you know it, you'll wind up back in this narrow way. So the last sentence there is the most important, I think. God has told you that you must never again return on that path, the constricting path, okay? He also must not have many wives, so that they may not take his heart to go astray. All right, so I know that God is not against wives, right? He told Abraham, listen to Sarah. Very simply, listen to Sarah, right? But this is about the heart. So we know what heart is in Hebrew. The word is lev in Hebrew, which is lamed vet. And that numerical value of lamed is 30. And the numerical value of vet or vet is 2. 32, right? Shloshim v'shtayim. Beginning of the Sefer Yetzirah tells us 32 magical, mystical paths, all related to the heart. Lev. Numerical value of the lamed being 30 is significant here. In all the Kabbalistic commentaries on this portion, it's very significant because there were 30. So from these points here, the sages came up with 30 requirements for the king. And these were the rules, these were the ideas. Shouldn't be a stranger, shouldn't have too many horses, right? Not too many wives. These were the things that consisted of the 30 and their subdivisions. So 30 was an important number. Lamed is the numerical value of 30. Lamed is a connector like Vav, but in particular, it's a connector of the brain and the heart with above and below. Connecting Aleph with the brain and the heart. So it's also true that, according to the Midrash, that in this direction it was said, not just your brother should be a king, but your brothers from the tribe of Yehuda only. So legitimate king comes from the tribe of Yehuda. Yehuda's numerical value is 30. King David was anointed as the official king when he was 30. Kabbalists believe that until you're 30, your soul isn't fully developed. Your strength isn't fully developed. Some even believe you get a new soul at 30, another one, glomming into it, depending upon what you've done in preparation between that time. So this number 30 or this age is a thing. The Lamed itself consists of the letter Kaf, which has a numerical value of 20. The letter Kaf and the letter Vav, so they put them together and it makes a Lamed. And the letter Vav has a numerical value of 6. So that's 26, which is the Tetragrammaton, or the holy name of God. So all these numbers come together. And the idea is that the two witnesses, it's about connection. The Lamed is a letter of connection. Vav is a letter of connection. So if we think about being connected in our world of action, which the king has to be, right? And our inner world, our holy of holies, that connection is what makes for higher consciousness. So why is there an issue with many wives? Because a husband and a wife love each other, and it's a matter of the brain and the heart in that love. But what can happen is the most positive thing is that they empower one another to higher states of consciousness. But that's relatively rare. You have two people who are committed to higher states of consciousness and not narrow, constricted ways of thinking. And their heart is open to the well of pure being and the Holy of Holies within them. That does not, in fact, that takes the heart and makes it bigger and more righteous for both of them. But your chances of that being true with so many wives, like I forget how many wives Solomon had, but it was his downfall. Because that love relationship and that connection and things that are physical are also spiritual. Sooner or later, when you multiply that and it goes out and it becomes more gross than finer relative, right? Subtle. So the ultimate thing is like Abraham and Sarah, right? The ultimate thing is like those examples. But when you expand that, as you can see in the Torah, there's more wives, there's more children, and then sooner or later, the heart is moved in a different direction. So that's caution. The next thing, and he shall likewise not accumulate very much silver and gold. I mean, obviously, there is the materialism. We don't want our king, the king of our throne, the king of our inner court, if he's attached to the tinsely, shiny things of the world, he's drawn away from unification with Ein Sof. When we studied the Sefer Yetzirah, we said there's really only one good and evil. Good is that which unifies you with God within yourself and around you. And evil is that which separates you. Right? So it's not that material things are bad, but if you're spending most of your life in that realm, then is the actions of your days occupied more with unification with God within you or silver and gold? So that's a question that everyone has to answer for themselves, right? And even in the Sefer Yetzirah, we talked about Zebulun and Issachar. There's a place for both of these things, as long as the heart is in the right place. There's a place for the merchant who supports the Torah scholar and their brothers. And that's the story of Zebulun and Issachar. Okay, last thing I want to go over. When a king is established in his royal throne, he must write a copy of this Torah as a scroll. That will always be with him, and he shall read from it all the days of his life. He will then learn to be in awe of God. This is Arya Kaplan's translation. Awe here is, the word in the Torah is actually yirah, which is mostly translated as fear. So when you read in the Torah, often it says the fear of God is the beginning of understanding, beginning of wisdom. I like Kaplan's translation as awe better, because yirah is a positive kind of fear. It's more like awe. Where pechad in Hebrew is the fear that keeps us back, keeps us constricted, makes us stay in Mitzrayim, right? So the awe comes from study, meditation, surrender. And that's what it's saying here. And then he will not begin to feel superior to his brethren. That's another critical factor, that whole ego trip. I mean, he's going to be king. The king within us, as we gain higher states of consciousness. We don't want to return to constricted consciousness. We also don't want to have haughty eyes. We want to be a humble servant. So that's not just what we want as a king, it's what we want as the governor of our lives. So the point here is connection. He has to have a copy of this Torah. So he has a copy of the Torah in the Holy of Holies, in the temple, in his home, but he also has a copy which he takes with him everywhere he goes. That's the nature of the two witnesses. We talked of chazmal, silence with speaking. Whatever we do in our active life, we're touching that godly, pure consciousness within us when we perform action. And that's really what I'm saying the direction of this lesson, of this Torah portion is.